I think that before we get into the detail of the DSH project, it's very, very important to understand the context in which this project is happening and the priority that government has given to this specific investment. Every day since I became Prime Minister, I'm focusing on three fundamental streams. So three things that I work on every single day, and I don't have the benefit of fixing one before I can get to the other one. So if we had a path to follow, a critical path to follow, I probably would have had one taking place before the other. But unfortunately, time does not allow us the ability to do that on a critical path. So the biggest impediment that we have right now as a government is debt. So when I begin my budget meetings with the different ministries, I'm very quick to point out the fact that we have $450 million, thereabout, of salaries, payroll, that we're paying. Another $88 million in pensions, and $180 million in debt financing. So the total budget is about just over $1 billion. So we're already at $800 million. And we have not even started talking about road repairs, school repairs, running your hospitals, your police, your judicial system, nothing. So when I say that the country is broke, if the country continues going on the path where it's now borrowing money to pay salaries, borrowing money literally to do everything. In fact, when debt comes to an end, we've not had a sinking fund to pay off that debt. So it means all we're doing is rolling over the same debt and then accumulating more debt on top of that. The pending crisis is, do we believe that interest rates are going to stay the same, go down, or increase over the next 3 to 5 years? I think that wisdom has it that interest rates are going to go up. And that means that we have to have a greater sense of urgency to deal with the current debt situation. So debt financing now, outside of payroll, is the single largest expenditure item that we have. So according to the last IMF report, our debt to GDP is in the vicinity of 81 to 82%. And depends on how you define debt, whether you include your statutory agencies or not, that number could potentially be much higher. But in terms of the ability or the capacity of the government at its current revenue numbers to carry that level of debt, I would say to you that that's impossible. So we're broke. So being broke doesn't mean you don't stop spending money. Being broke means if you continue down this path that we are going to be in a lot of trouble. So what are your options with debt? One is we can restructure. So another problem that we have with our current debt is that 50% of our debt is in short-term instruments, in treasury bills. The government did that for two reasons. One, they were not able to sell bonds, and two, they were trying to get less costly instruments, financial instruments. But we've realized that we cannot continue to afford to roll over debt almost every 2 years. It makes the country extremely vulnerable. And so that we have to borrow more money from bond placements. The good news is in the last 6 or 8 months, we've now seen a bigger appetite for bonds in Saint Lucia. In fact, we could have easily oversold the subscription that we had, but it comes at a cost of 7%. The second thing you want to do with your debt is to be able to pay down the debt. But to pay down the debt means you have to have surplus revenue to do that. And as I said, we've been running a deficit for many years, some larger than others, but every single year we're running a deficit. So taxes then becomes a way of being able to generate that revenue. And so the former government went on and increased all kinds of taxes. And we saw tax revenue increase, but at the same time, what did we see was the fact that the economy continued to contract. And this is the balancing. We need to grow our economy. And the question becomes, what's going to fuel that growth? Is there enough resources in the local market to generate the necessary growth that we need? Or are you going to have a combination of local investment as well as foreign direct investment? And if you're going to have foreign direct investment, what is it you're going to have to do to attract that investment? Can you, at the current tax levels, compete globally to attract that investment into Saint Lucia? Can businesses, once they're established here, make money under the current tax structure? So the studies that were done by both the CDB as well as the IMF all indicated that Saint Lucia right now, as a percentage of revenue, taxes as a percentage of revenue, that we are higher than even developed countries. We're collecting more taxes than anybody else is. So the question then becomes how we're spending that money, which is where DSH comes into play some part. The second thing that I'm working on simultaneously is the civil service. I mean, I think all of us who are in business would look at your payroll, and if your payroll is almost 48% of your total cost, that if you want to see a marked difference in what you're doing, you need to focus on that 48%. The ability of us to reduce the amount of money that we're spending on the payroll is not very great. You know, we are in with unionized, we have long-term contracts, people are permanent members of the public service. So when you start looking at the number of people that are on contracts, there's not very much wiggle room that you have. So if you can't change the absolute number, then what you need to do is to focus on how can I make it more productive? How do I, if I'm going to spend this money, how do I make this that this is going to be an engine of growth for us? And this is why I don't just use the word modernization of the public service, but a re-engineering of the public service. If we take a very simple thing of permanent secretaries. Permanent secretary is supposed to be your CEO, your key governance person. And what we've seen over the years is what I call the bastardization of that position. One, in which technocrats have migrated into that position because it's the highest paid job in the civil service. And the worst thing to have is a technocrat in a position of governance. Because what happens is that they tend to now become the order givers, and the consultation with the technocrats is lost because they know what they're supposed to do. And in the public service, people become disenfranchised very quickly because there is no consequence of being disenfranchised. Nobody's going to fire you. The next thing is that the permanent secretaries were made given contracts, which is completely contrary to the Constitution. In order for a permanent secretary to remain impartial, is that that position is constitutionally protected. That's why it's called a permanent secretary. A minister cannot change that person. We can move them around, but we cannot get rid of a permanent secretary for that constitutional reason. So we want to go back and start training our permanent secretaries and putting in new regulations which will limit the control that government or ministers have over permanent secretaries and keep them conformed to what they're supposed to be doing, which is compliance. They are, for the civil servants here, chief accounting officers is what they're really referred to as. And how does that affect government? Is because if they're not doing their job, then the implementation of programs suffers. And right now we can see that, you know, we're not the best implementers currently. The other thing that we have to focus on in the civil service is succession. Where are the needs going to be? Are we making sure that we're training our people and that we know that as time goes by and attrition takes place, that we're replacing those people with well-educated, well-trained individuals that are going to help now produce a great civil service. I was saying to Mr. Bunker, I'm looking forward to the day where the public service celebrates our private sector. The public service goes, we have a fantastic private sector, and we think that they're one of the best private sectors out there. But equally, I'm looking forward to the day where the private sector is going to say, I love my public sector. I would not know how I could exist or how I could be successful without my public sector. But that's the relationship that we need in order to be able to be successful in the world today. The third arm that I'm working on is investment. I truly believe, my cabinet believes, my government believes, that to solve our problems, that we have to grow the economy. That $1 billion worth of expenditure and $1 billion US of GDP just is not sufficient to be able to carry the expenses that we have and to generate the basic human right needs that all our citizens so richly deserve. The question becomes, do you think that Saint Lucia can grow? Do you think that there's enough land here to develop, to grow? Do you think that there is a big enough market to absorb whatever we produce? And those are the questions you have to ask yourselves. When we asked ourselves that question, what do we look at? We look at tourism, that we have 3,500 hotel rooms. Put that in perspective. For those of you who've been to Vegas, the Aria Hotel is 4,500 rooms, one hotel. We're 3,500. The Caribbean, as an entire entity, is 1.5% of the world tourism. And Saint Lucia is less than 1% of the Caribbean's tourism. We get 150,000 US arrivals a year. Jamaica gets 750,000 US arrivals from New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Jamaica. Mexico gets 43 million US arrivals. And that includes people crossing by car. So the scope, in my mind, for growth in tourism is tremendous. I don't even think we're scratching the surface yet. Do we believe that we can grow in agriculture? We used to produce 120,000 tons of bananas. We're now producing 12. We think that we can easily get back up to 60,000 tons, and there's a potential of bringing it back even higher than that. Cocoa. We used to produce 500 tons of cocoa in our peak. We're now producing 30. Great potential. A product in which we produce one of the premium cocos of the world. So we're not as susceptible to price as some of the other commodities. And it's great if we're talking about climate change in terms of our environment. Our manufacturing sector is under pressure. But I still think that there's an opportunity for growth if we do a better job of negotiating our trade agreements. And if we are seeing our economy grow here and we focus on how we can make those linkages work, I think that there's growth potential. So the question becomes, how much growth potential do you think that there is? I think conservatively, Saint Lucia can easily absorb 10,000 hotel rooms. Easily. And while we're doing that, I don't think it's going to have any impact on what we're doing with agriculturally. I don't think it's going to have any impact. If anything, it's going to have positive impacts on agriculture and positive impacts on manufacturing. We believe that offshore financial services. Saint Lucia has been incredibly successful with our IBCs, International Business Corporations. We'll be announcing very soon the expansion of our IBC legislation through its regulations, which is going to encourage regional companies not only to have their offices here, but to have their headquarters offices in Saint Lucia. And all of a sudden now, if you think of a company having its worldwide headquarters in Saint Lucia, and the employment that that's going to generate, and the services that it's going to need in terms of accountants and our lawyers, and the impact it's going to have on our overall economy. So even if it's operating as an IBC, meaning in a tax-free environment, or a reduced tax environment because it's 1%, but the impact here is huge, and that's what we think Castries offers us. We think that Castries can be a catalyst for getting these companies to come here. With the headquarters offices, there's one big market, which is the financial market, but that financial market is going to require us to be able to get a very stable credit rating. So I don't think that I can honestly tell you that within the 5 years that we can change Saint Lucia's credit rating sufficiently to be able to attract offshore financial companies to Saint Lucia. I think we can improve it, but I don't think we can improve it to the point where they're going to come here. So the idea is, can we create a municipality? Can we create a designated area that can have its own credit rating? And that's some of the things that we're working on. So I bring that up to you because I'm getting to the DSH project. The DSH project was inherited by my government. It's a project that, if I'm not misunderstanding, 16 months or 15 months of negotiations had been taking place between Invest Saint Lucia and the DSH group. In fact, when they first came here, what they were interested in building was just a horse racing track. And that then grew to a bigger project. And the location, the original location that was designated for DSH was primarily driven by government, not by DSH. So the area by Beau-Saint-Jou and also using the mangrove, that's what happened. So when I came in and I met with Mr. T.I. King, and Mr. T.I. King had basically gotten frustrated with Saint Lucia and had moved on. So in fact, it was a businessman in another country who was showing him around, who said to him, look, there's a new prime minister in Saint Lucia. I know him. I think he's a great guy. Why don't you give him a call? Because it seems that your heart's still set on Saint Lucia. So he came over. I met with him. I was extremely impressed with him and in terms of what he had told me that he had done. I did my own due diligence. I called up friends in Dubai. Is it true that Mr. Atea King was the architect behind the Palm Island? The answer was yes. Is it true that he was the architect and the main contractor overseeing the construction of the major the horse racing track in Dubai? The answer was yes. Was he a graduate of Harvard University, top of his class in architecture and master planning? The answer was yes. Did he design and build for the Malaysian government, their government city outside of Kuala Lumpur? The answer was yes. I then took him up on his offer, and I went to China. And going to China was not an easy decision because of our relationship with Taiwan. But I met with the Taiwanese, and I met with everybody else, and I said, if there's going to be a business conference in which there are opportunities for Saint Lucia to grow and to the benefit of our country, no country in the world is off my territory where I go. So I went because he was hosting a major event of a horse racing event in what we call Inner Mongolia. And this was an area in which the government of China had given him 6,000 acres of land and had given him a horse racing track that they had built for a celebration, an international airport, and they also built a monorail system, a fast bullet train that would be 2.5 hours to Beijing. So when I went there, who did I meet? I met with horse racing stables from Kentucky, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Malaysia. And I started understanding what the China Horse Club was about. China Horse Club was a group of individuals who had a passion for horse racing. And so the membership is $1 million to be able to join the club. And they have over 300 members. And that group now has become the 9th largest syndicate of thoroughbred horses in the world. So they're the 9th largest owner of thoroughbred horses in the world. So I was sufficiently impressed that the people that I met were well established in their industry and had an incredibly high regard for Teo. And while Teo was a new entry into the market, what they loved about him is that he had some new vision for horse racing. And his biggest vision is for the legalization of horse racing and gambling, of gambling in China. So currently the way that it works in China is you go to a horse racing track, but you buy a lottery ticket. So the machine picks your horse for you. You can't bet directly on a horse. And he believes that at some point China will open it up because, Chinese love to gamble. And it's very successful in Hong Kong, and it's very successful around the world. And what does he see the opportunity? There's 450,000 thoroughbred horses in the world today. He believes that China will have a demand for over 1 million for itself. So doing the project here in St. Lucia, and what he wanted to be able to do, he tried to do this project in China. But because the horse racing gambling was not available, the project has been stalled. And so he said, okay, let me go outside of China and build up a facility in which now this can become the model for when we want to do it in China. So that's why he chose St. Lucia. And he chose St. Lucia because we don't have major horse racing here. To go to a Barbados or go to a Trinidad or go to a Puerto Rico or to go to a Panama where horse racing is so established and try to create a new model would be extremely difficult. So coming here, it was fresh ground. And then in addition to that, he liked the fact that we were close to the international airport, so that when we now want to create a quarantine system, so the idea is that people can buy horses from North America, they can bring the horses here, they'll be here for 3 months on quarantine, and then they'll be exported over to China or to other parts of the world. So being in proximity to the airport was a big thing for him. Once I understood that he had the vision and the capacity to be able to implement the project, I supported the project. Now let's talk about transparency. And I think it's a very important discussion. What does transparency mean? Does transparency mean that every single document that government signs, it ought to be visible to the public? Or is transparency that if I sign a document, and there are times in which I can sit here and justify why a document would be on a confidentiality basis, but I have to be answerable to the process and the due diligence that we did in signing that contract. What did I do to make sure I protected the assets of the state? What did we do? How did we go through this whole process? So as I said, this process started with Invest Saint Lucia. It was 15 months of files. I did my own personal due diligence. We had companies check out who DSH was and confirm that they were who they were. Then it becomes now, why do we have a framework agreement? Framework agreement is that we understand some basic principles together, and that we're now going to agree to proceed now to develop those basic principles into a final agreement. Is a framework agreement binding? It is. But if we reach an impasse on any of the issues, whether they have a problem with what we're saying or we have a problem with what they're saying, you can't continue. But it's to agree to those things to go into a final document. Then it becomes the question of leasing land or selling land. I read the Robert Ainsworth letter in Parliament, not to make a mockery or to embarrass the government, but the fact is what was in the Robert Ainsworth letter is no different than what we would be discussing with anybody. The idea that we give corporate tax-free holidays, the idea that we give personal income tax holidays, the idea that we give away alien manos licenses, this is not new. This has all been done before. It's all been discussed. They have a whole bunch of deals out there that already includes that. Their argument was that it was impossible to give one man. They claim 800 acres, but the total amount of land that we're in discussion right now is just under 600 acres. But yet, they had negotiated a deal where potentially one single person would have owned 4,500 acres, or thereabout, in St. Lucia. So it can't be that we're scared of one person having that amount of land. The idea that you're going to have a lease of $1 a square foot, sorry, $1 an acre per year on public space. And the only public space that was identified to do that was the horse racing track, which is about 350 acres, thereabout. The other area that was identified as a public space was when we were going to build in the mangrove, that they were going to build a museum, which would have been for public use, and that also would have been leased as public space. All the remaining lands are to be sold between 60,000 US or 90,000 US dollars an acre, based on the location and negotiation. Question becomes, why would the horse racing track be deemed public? He's investing his own money. There's no CIP monies going into the horse racing track. There's no Chinese contractor that's going into the horse racing track. My understanding is they're intending to use local contractors for the horse racing track. The full operating cost of the horse racing track is his. We're talking about maintenance of 400 horses in Saint Lucia. So the staffing, the food, and everything else that goes along with that. They're proposing to run horse racing every week, which will then be televised internationally and run as an international lottery. And that's where the money is going to come from to pay for the purses and also to be able to maintain the horse racing track. That's his risk. We don't believe that that's going to be a huge revenue generator. It operates like a golf course. It's an attraction. What we find when I go out there, the passion for horse racing is amazing. The fraternity of all these people who love horses. I mean, I just met, for the second time, I met him last week for the first time. I met him yesterday at the opening of the new airport in St. Vincent. Is Mr. Chin from Trinidad, who is the owner of Movie Town. Okay? Bursting with excitement. Horse racing fanatic. Was going to go to Guyana, was going to go to other countries. Now guess what's moved up in priority? Saint Lucia. Why? What differentiates Saint Lucia was this horse racing track. And so I'm just saying to you that, you know, they call it the sport of kings, because it is. All these incredibly wealthy people love it. And they just become blinded by it and they want to be here. And that's what differentiates Saint Lucia. So the project has different phases, and I think that they're going to discuss this afternoon, phase one of the project, which is the horse racing track. We've also identified the area by Il Pirata and also the area by Point Sab as another area where we've asked him, because we couldn't do the mangrove. And I want to make it very, very clear, because it'll be easy for me to run away from trouble. The only reason why we didn't do the development in the mangrove is because of the garbage dump. Not because of major environmental concerns as it pertains to the mangrove. I want to be very, very clear. So it means if we can get the garbage dump situation resolved, right, we may put the mangrove back on the table for looking at development. And I think the important statement here is that when you go and you look at Mr. Teo Aking's history, he's actually revered as one of the best architects in Asia, but more importantly, as one of the most green-sensitive architects in Asia. So he's not coming down here to destroy anything. In fact, we're the ones who have been destroying the mangrove. We've had a garbage dump for over 15 years seeping into the mangrove that's been killing the front of the mangrove. In fact, the plan that he had was to open up part of the mangrove to allow more salt water to be able to come in, cleaner fresh water coming in, and allowing the mangrove actually to grow even more. And in fact, put a museum in the middle of the mangrove in order that we can appreciate what a mangrove does and make it part of our tourist attraction. It's something that we've not even done for ourselves.